This video is for NVivo Analysis Project 2 for ADF 6479 Qualitative Data Analysis. In the first project, you created an NVivo file, organized your data, engaged in coding, used tools to highlight connections within your project, and reflected on the content and process through Memos. Project 2 is an expansion of Project 1. You should continue working in the same file and building upon your analysis. In this project, you will revisit your codes and coding structure to engage in second cycle coding and classify your data. You will also continue to highlight connections within the project and reflect on the content and process. As you work on the advanced analysis in Project 2, you are simultaneously creating matrices, networks, and graphics to display your data. Miles Huberman and Saldana describe the importance of using visuals. Their central argument is you know what you display. Creating a display challenges you to condense your data systematically while also using the full scope of the data to answer your research questions. As you work on NVivo Analysis Project 2, consider how the tools in NVivo can support the creation of visual displays. And consider how you can add displays back to your NVivo project to continue strengthening the web of ideas. As you move deeper into analyzing your data, I want to normalize feelings of uncertainty or a sense that the process is messy. However, this by no means lets you off the hook when it comes to grounding your work in theory. Before you move into NVivo Project 2, be sure to read the article by Bhattacharya, which is posted in Canvas, and give careful consideration to your positionality and how your worldview is influencing both your coding and your orientation to using qualitative data analysis software. The keyword for Project 2 is iterative. As you move forward with your project, it can feel like you're taking 3 steps forward and 2 steps back. But it is important to cycle back in order to strategically move forward using the information you have to answer your research questions. In the coding manual for qualitative researchers, Saldana points out the importance of transitioning between first cycle coding and second cycle coding. This may include selecting new analysis methods for looking at your data, constructing categories based on the codes you've created, or drawing preliminary models to look at the direction of your data and your study. Finally, before we jump into Project 2, I want to give a reminder about Memos. Sometimes we make the mistake of elevating coding as the most important part of analysis, but it's actually one piece that works in tandem with all other aspects. The memos you write and the connections you build within your project enable you to explore patterns and build towards themes, narrative elements, a theory, or other findings depending upon your methods. Continue to use memos to capture your thoughts throughout the process. To demonstrate NVivo Analysis Project 2, I'll continue using the data for the students who are engaged in the summer service immersion experiences. In Project 1, you began coding interview or focus group transcripts, social media data, field notes, images, or articles depending upon your project. Looking at your codebook and your initial list of codes should help you consider how to proceed. In looking at the list of codes, consider if they are relevant to your study and if each bucket represents a unique and distinctive idea. If you remember from the coding video, we talked about lumping and splitting. If you're someone who lumped the data together in large chunks, you may end up parsing your data into more nuanced codes in the second round of coding. If you're someone who split the data into smaller segments, you may end up aggregating the data into larger categories. In this video, I'll describe 4 possible next steps in the coding process: creating categories or a node tree, coding on, combining codes, and deleting codes. As you revisit your codes, one possibility is you may combine codes. It's important to make sure that each idea only appears once and that each code is distinctive. I accidentally created 2 codes that were very similar, one for excited and one for excitement. In this case, I'm going to cut the code for excitement and then merge into the selected node. And then you can see that the number of references for excited has gone from 6 to 7 because I merged in a new piece of information. Another example in this project, I created a code for journey and service journey, and they have very similar descriptions. So I'm going to cut the code for journey and then merge into the selected node of service journey. In this case, you'll see the number of references did not increase, and this is because the information that was coded to journey was exactly the same as something else coded to service journey, so NVivo combined them, but didn't have any new information to incorporate into the node. Another possibility when you're looking at your coding structure is you may need to code on. Coding on is when you have a code that has a lot of information in it, and maybe you can take what was lumped into that code and break it into smaller pieces to better answer your question. In this example, I know the code build relationships represents different types of relationships, and based on my project, it's important to distinguish between those. So I'll open up the code for build relationships, and one that I can remember is team building. So I will highlight this information and create a new code for team building. Because in this particular project I don't want the information duplicated, I'm going to uncode it from this node. Then I can take the code for team building, cut it, and paste it under build relationships. This will create a parent-child relationship between these codes. There is also an example of building relationships through community organizing. So I'll create a new node for community organizing. Then I'll highlight the text directly from this node, code it to the new node, and encode it from this node. Those are two ways to code on information so that you can parse out something in more detail. In some cases, you may find a code that you want to delete. You might think that the code no longer makes sense. Maybe you started coding something to it and realized it wasn't relevant, or maybe you're going to use attributes and classifications to capture that information otherwise. In this case, I started coding blog posts related to Chicago and realized that I'm going to use location as an attribute assigned to the files and the cases. So I don't need to code to the node Chicago anymore. So I'm going to right-click and delete this node. And NVivo is going to make sure that I want to delete this item, and I do. If you're worried about deleting a node that you might want to come back to later, you can create a subfolder in the nodes. I'll call this one archive. And you can cut and paste nodes into the archive folder. I would only recommend using this for something that you are nervous about deleting and you want to hold on to for a little bit longer, and you definitely want to write a memo to explain why you've created another folder under your nodes. As you revisit your codes, you will begin to organize them into categories according to the newest version of the qualitative data analysis with NVivo text. Sorting nodes into hierarchies helps with organization and creating order. Revisiting the nodes can often help clarify ideas or see areas of overlap. A hierarchy of nodes can prompt rich coding, which will support the next steps in your analysis. And finally, creating a hierarchy can help you identify patterns in your data. Although ultimately you will reflect your coding structure in your NVivo project, there are a number of ways to approach organizing your codes. Some people like to write on a whiteboard, some people prefer to write their codes on index cards and manipulate them on a table, and some people like to work within the NVivo project itself. I'll demonstrate how to move the codes around in your coding structure and also how to use a mind map in NVivo to organize your codes. One way to create node trees or hierarchies, or to put your nodes into categories, is to manipulate the data right here on the screen. In this example, I know that there are a number of codes related to emotions, so I'm going to create a parent code for emotions. Then I'm going to use shortcut keys and scroll through my nodes to move all of the emotion nodes under the parent node. Now, when I click on the plus sign next to emotions, you can see the parent node and all of the child nodes. Right now, emotions doesn't have any files or references, but if I wanted to see all of the references for emotions in one place, I can aggregate coding from children. And now you'll see all of the distinctive references and files are indicated for emotions. And when I click on emotions, I'm going to see everything that was coded to anxious, discomfort, excited, and nervous. In Project 3, we'll talk more about maps. However, at this point in the process, you may want to create a map of all of your nodes so it's easier to move them around and create categories. To get my nodes into my project map, I'll click Add Project Items. I want to add my nodes, but I don't want to add the archive nodes. So what we're seeing now are all of the nodes in the project and a few of them that have relationships. I'll move them so it's easier to see. Now you can see that I have 2 parent nodes, which each have some child nodes, and then I have a number of nodes that don't have any connections at this point. One of the things I can do in the project map is move the nodes around into clusters or categories that make sense, and then I can translate that back into my coding structure. So I'm going to take a moment and move things around to create some categories from these nodes. So you can see I've created some clusters and some categories that I will then reflect in my coding structure. It's also worth noting I left this node out here by itself because I can't remember what was coded to this, and I need to go back and look at the content of the node before I can put it in a category. And then I found several that I remember these either weren't used extensively or what was coded initially doesn't really make sense in this emerging structure, so I'm probably going to delete these codes. So I'm going to go back to my coding structure and make the changes that are reflected here in my project map. So I've started manipulating my coding structure, and I've realized that fun isn't really an emotion, and I'm not really sure that fun fits anywhere else. So I'm going to open this code, and I can see in coding stripes that this is also coded to outreach, and when I reread the passage, it really is more about outreach than the idea of fun, and so I'm going to go ahead and delete that code. This was a useful process for me to physically manipulate the nodes, and even as I was shifting them around within the node tree itself, I realized I needed to make some additional changes that I hadn't seen in my project map. And for a number of codes, I had to open them up and figure out what was in that code and sort of jog my memory to figure out where that code fit. For example, the social media code was about using social media to build relationships with people. As you move forward, there are 2 cautions I want to give. One is not to create a viral coding structure, and the other is to beware of quantifying the qualitative. A viral coding structure repeats ideas multiple times, just as a virus replicates. For example, you might have multiple codes which all have subcodes of positive and negative, or you might have multiple codes which all have subcodes for all of the participants. This can quickly become cumbersome and unwieldy, making it difficult to navigate your data, and it also decreases the utility of your coding structure for running queries. To avoid a viral coding structure, make sure each category or concept appears only once in the coding structure. As you can see, NVivo tells you the number of files and references for each of your codes, but I want to caution against relying too much on the numbers. Although this information may be useful, we can fall into the trap of quantifying the qualitative and thinking that something that has a higher number of references may be more significant than something else. This is not always the case, so you have to open the node, read the content, and determine the quality of what you coded and how that information may help answer your questions. One other type of node you can use in NVivo is relationships. This is only available in NVivo for Windows. They allow you to connect people, ideas, and concepts in a directional way. For example, someone in your study may serve as a mentor for someone else. That's not something you'd necessarily be able to indicate in the coding structure or the classifications, but you could indicate that using a relationship. In order to create a relationship code, you first have to create a relationship type. In this project, one of the things I've noticed is a student's passion for a topic informs their experience serving in an agency. I'm going to create a new relationship type for informs. And this is a one-way relationship. Once I've created the relationship type, I can create a new relationship. First, I select the From node. In this case, that node would be passion. I want to select my relationship type, and then I can select the To node. In this case, service task. Now, as I'm coding, when I find an example where passion informs service tasks, I can code that to the relationship node. Classifications allow you to describe the files or cases in your project. While a node holds a concept or an idea, a case holds all of the information specific to a person or other unit of analysis for your project. File classifications allow you to describe the different types of data in your project. Classifications are an important building block as you work towards running queries in your project. When it comes to classifying data, consider which attributes and values might be useful for your research question and methods. For this project, you can see that I'm using the classification of person, and some of the attributes I want to use include major, location of their service, race, ethnicity, and whether or not the students are international students. For each attribute, you have different values, which you can apply to different participants. I'll go through 3 steps in classifying your data. The first is creating classifications and attributes. The second is creating cases. And finally, you'll assign data to the cases. The information about cases is in its own section in your NVivo project. The first step is to create a case classification. To create a case classification, click on New Case Classification. NVivo has 2 predefined classifications, person and organization. You can also create a new classification if there's another unit of analysis that is salient for your project. In this case, I'm going to modify the classification for person. Now that I have the classification, I can see the associated attributes. So I'm going to change this to reflect the attributes that I'm most interested in. I can also add additional attributes. Once I've created all of my attributes, then I can go in and assign values. Go to Attribute Properties, Values, and then add the possible values that apply to your project. Like this, you would continue to assign values to all of your attributes. Once you've created the type of classification, Now you can create the cases. To create a case, go to New Case. For this project, each participant will be a case. Once I choose the person classification, all of the attributes populate. Now I can go in and assign values to this participant. You'll see here that I didn't fill in the values for a major, but I can type it in here directly, and this will become a value. If you only have a few cases, you could add them manually. If you have a lot of cases or a lot of attributes, which are organized in an Excel spreadsheet, it's fairly easy to import them using the Import Wizard. Under Case Classification, select Import Classification Sheets, and select the Excel spreadsheet with the participant information. I want to create case classifications. In this file, each case is represented as a name, and I want the file to create new cases if they don't already exist in the project. I don't have any dates, times, or numbers, so I'm going to click Finish and see what I get. So you can see here that all of my participants have been added as cases, and you can see the classification sheet with all of their information. So instead of me having to type this manually, the information was imported directly. Now we're at step 3, which is to assign information to the cases. The easiest way to code a large number of files to a case is to select all of the files, then click Code, and choose the case to which you'd like to code the files. When I go to Cases, I can see that Alyssa has 17 files associated with her case. To recap, the 3 steps are to first create the case classification and select the attributes that are most applicable to your cases. Next, create cases, either by inputting them one at a time or uploading a classification sheet. And finally, code your data to the appropriate case so that you can see the files associated with that person. File classifications are for storing bibliographical information, which can be especially useful if you're using NVivo for a review of literature. If you have multiple types of data, you can classify data by type and then run a query to compare coding between the data. File classifications live under the Data tab in NVivo. Go to New File Classification, and you'll see here that there are a lot of different types of predefined files. We'll start with blog. There are a lot of attributes that you can possibly have for a blog. I'm going to limit the number of attributes to what is salient for my project. You can see the number of attributes that are salient for this project working with blogs is much smaller than the number that was initially provided in the file classification. When working with file classifications, you can also import from a number of different services which manage your references, and that can be very useful if you're using NVivo to analyze articles or for a literature review. In this project, I have 4 types of data and journal articles, so I've created 5 file classifications. Now I can go to my data and assign a file classification. I can do this by right-clicking, going to Classification, and choosing the appropriate classification. You can see over here that the classification has been updated. I can also do this by selecting multiple documents at the same time and classifying them. Let's take a look at one of the participants. There are 4 types of data here. First, I'll classify the blog posts, then the photos, then the proposal, and finally the interview audio. Now I can see the 4 types of data I've classified for this person. Once I've classified all the data, when I click on the different types of file classifications, I can see all the information in one place. If I had added articles to the project using RefWorks or EndNote, I'd probably have this information already. But because I didn't, I'll need to take the time to fill in the values for each attribute for each article in order to allow myself to search based on these values at some point in the future. For example, I may add all of the authors and years and titles, and then I will be able to use queries to sift through and look at only what is coded to articles in a particular year, or only what is coded to articles from a particular journal. This may seem like a tedious process at this point, but this is setting the foundation to allow you to run queries and dig into your data in the next step in the process. In this video, I talked about second cycle coding, relationship codes, and classifying your data. I have a few recommendations as you move forward with your project. The first is to set aside time for your work. Qualitative research requires a significant investment of time, including time for reflection. Qualitative data analysis is not a linear process. It is an iterative process that requires circling back to the work you've completed and considering it before moving forward. Ask for feedback from colleagues. Sometimes it's helpful just to have someone listen while you describe your thought process. And if someone is familiar with your topic, they can provide helpful feedback as you develop your codes and sift through first cycle coding to create a hierarchy of codes. Write memos prolifically. Memos are where the analysis happens and where you capture all of your emerging ideas. And finally, consider how the visuals you're creating for the analysis and practice assignment can support your work in your project in NVivo. This is a reference list for the books and articles that I mentioned in this video, and all pictures are free stock photos from pexels.com. I hope this was a useful video as you consider why you're doing the things you're doing as you transition from first cycle coding to the next steps in analysis. If you have any questions, please email me at jvwhite@fsu.edu.